Uh, Before starting, I want to quickly go over a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. At any time during presentation, you can submit your questions and comments by clicking on the chat box, and we will review them as they come in, and we will try to address them on the Q&A session. Also, during the Q&A session, if you would like to make an announcement, please indicate that by sending a message in the text box so we can activate your microphone. Okay. And one last note, if you are not speaking, please mute your microphone. So the background noises are not transmitted during the presentation and the discussion. Now, let's start with the webinar and hear from Maria.
Can you hear me now? All right. Apologies about that. I was about to say good morning, but my microphone was still on mute. My name is Marije Rewijn. I'm a local governance specialist with the Public Finance and Local Governance Unit here at HQ. And today I'll be presenting the findings of the global stocktake of UNICEF engagement in decentralization and local governance, or DeLoG for short. So as Nima mentioned, this webinar is divided in two parts, and I will start with a brief presentation on key concepts which will form the basis for the second part of this webinar on the findings of the stocktake. The outline of this first part is as follows. First, I will briefly present on why DeLoG is relevant to UNICEF, why do this presentation, why engage in a stocktake. Second, I will go over briefly go over key objectives of decentralization reform, discuss key concepts including decentralization and local governance, mention some key items to keep in mind, and after that there will be some time for a question and answer related to this part. Now first, why is DeLoG relevant? This graph is based on a country office annual report analysis, which I did from 2011 to 2014, as well as from a DeLoG questionnaire that was recently sent out and completed by 66 country offices. And when we put all the data together, we found that 95 country offices worldwide engage in some type of DeLoG related initiative. There is especially strong engagement in CECIS region, EPRO, LACRO, ROSA, but as well as in WACARO. In these areas, in these regions, over 70% of country offices engage in this area. So UNICEF engagement really happens in all types of contexts. It happens across income status in lower income countries and middle income countries, as well as in fragile contexts. And mostly this engagement is mature. Of the 57 country offices that reported DeLoG engagement, nearly 70% mentioned to be doing so for 5 years or more. This slide represents also a question that was in a DeLoG questionnaire. The question asked about the nature of DeLoG engagement within country offices, and it was mentioned that it's mostly cross-sectoral, so more so even than being social policy based. And quite a number of country offices reported that the nature of DeLoG engagement is actually sector-based, such as education and health. Were frequently mentioned. And this is not surprising because DeLoG is essentially about service delivery. Now, why do countries engage in decentralization? Some of the common objectives include the deepening of democratic processes. So by establishing additional layers of local government, it's thought to deepen democracy. Another objective is enhancing good governance, including participation, transparency, and accountability. Improving service delivery by placing decision-making closer to people, and to better address some of the increasing complexities of service delivery. So this comes from the realization that the central government cannot possibly implement all aspects of service delivery. And in some countries, decentralization has come as the result of internal conflicts. Now, UNICEF may be most interested in aspects of participation and accountability, as well as the objective related to service delivery. However, even when not explicitly focusing on the other objectives, these should still be taken into account, especially as decentralization is essentially a political process. And what I also want to mention here is that these objectives around accountability and participation, as well as around service delivery, are really also in line with principles underlying the CRC, as well as principles that are reflected in UNICEF's strategic plan. And here is also a relationship with the Morris framework, as DeLoG essentially is a key aspect of the enabling environment. Now, when talking about decentralization, it's important to keep in mind that there is no universally accepted definition, either among countries or among development partners. For instance, in Anglophone countries, different definitions may be used than in Francophone countries. Also, it's important to keep in mind that decentralization can refer to both an existing governance structure as well as an active reform process. So while the definition on decentralization is kind of fuzzy, the definition that I like is that decentralization is about the transfer of decision-making power, service delivery functions, and associated financial resources. And as this definition implies, there are political, administrative, and fiscal dimensions to decentralization. Okay, so in terms of political decentralization, political decentralization is essentially about the transfer of political power and authority to subnational levels of government. And political decentralization is often associated with democratic governance and devolution. And as such, key aspects include, for instance, the establishment of a legal and policy framework on decentralization, the establishment of various processes on downward accountability, ensuring that there is room for participatory processes, processes around data and M&E, as well as electoral issues. So some of these aspects can be covered by UNICEF, and some are beyond the scope of UNICEF engagement. In terms of administrative decentralization, this is really about the redistribution of public service delivery functions. So this could either be from the center to subnational actors, either line departments or local governments. It could be from line departments to local governments, so more horizontally, or it could even be from government actors to non-governmental actors. And there are three ways of doing this. The first is devolution, then delegation, and deconcentration. Now, devolution is really at the heart of decentralization. It's about the transfer of service delivery functions to local governments. And in this, local governments have full discretion in decision-making about these functions, As well, they are accountable to their constituencies for the devolved function. So there is a strong local discretion in decision making, and accountability for the delivered services is mostly downward towards the constituency, the electorates. In delegation, it's also about the transfer of service delivery functions to local governments, but in this case, local governments are primarily accountable to the agency which delegated the responsibility. So there is less discretion in decision making, and accountability is primarily upward. In deconcentration, the transfer of service delivery functions is to line departments. So, for instance, your district health department or your district education department. In this, these departments have limited discretion in decision making. Basically, they implement the functions on behalf of the central ministry, and they're also accountable towards this ministry for the functions that they're implementing. Now, when sector colleagues talk about decentralization, they frequently actually refer to deconcentration, whereas governance people, when they talk about decentralization, they mostly talk about devolution. And it's important to keep these distinctions in mind, because deconcentration is not the same as devolution. In devolution, local governments have a political decision-making power of how to implement functions. They have their own local budgets. They can plan according to their local needs. So there's political aspects come into play, whereas within deconcentration, the implementation of the services are more uniform across the country. Key aspects of administrative decentralization, for instance, include functional reassignment. This is deciding which functions go where. Then another key aspect is coordination of between the different levels of government. For instance, in decentralization, the delivery of services becomes increasingly complex because of the different actors involved. So therefore, it's also important that these actors coordinate with each other. Another aspect to keep in mind is that with the transfer of functions, this usually coincides with the transfer of staff as well. So when a central ministry devolves a function, the idea is that they will also transfer the associated staff. So often administrative decentralization coincides with civil service reform. And then finally, another aspect is the strengthening of local capacities and processes for service delivery. In terms of fiscal decentralization, this is really about how local governments are funded. This can either be through own revenues, through local government debt and borrowing, as well as intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And these are reflected in the key aspects as well as local budgeting processes. And in terms of local governance, decentralization really sets the framework for local governance. And again, local governance is a rather vague concept, but it's essentially about who is participating on a local level in decision making, how are decisions translated into action, and what are the available resources and their allocation. And local governments play a central role in local governance. Local governments are autonomous institutions within a specific geographical area, and they typically consist of a local executive and legislative body, as well as an administrative arm. So this could include administrative staff, your planning officer, your human resource officer, as well as technical staff, which are supposed to support the implementation of services. The representative body may be directly or indirectly elected or appointed, and there are also cases where it's a mixed form. Now, things to keep in mind. aspects of decentralization and local governance are intimately related, so they should really be seen together. The concept of accountability is key in political decentralization, and ideally decentralization reform includes political, administrative, and fiscal decentralization. But this is not always the case. So depending on a country context, one aspect of decentralization may be emphasized over other aspects. And it could also be that within a country context, different actors may favor certain aspects of decentralization over others. For instance, local governments may strongly advocate for the transfer of services to the local level, whereas sector ministries may be hesitant to do so. So it's important to keep in mind that, even within a country, there may be, not every actor is on the same line in terms of decentralization. So now it's time for some questions. If you have questions about this first part, if you would like some clarifications on key concepts, this is the time to post the questions.
Okay, thank you, Maria. So we can take around maybe 3 questions, and you can submit your question in the chat box, or indicate if you want to speak, so we unmute your microphone. Okay, we have okay, Hannah, please.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Mariah. I have a question regarding political decentralization versus administrative and fiscal. As we know, political decentralization may be quite sensitive for some contexts. Would it be possible and advisable maybe to engage rather in fiscal decentralization and or administrative decentralization without getting involved with political aspects? Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, to address the first question by Hannah, yes, it is possible to, of course, address administrative and fiscal decentralization and not really go deeper into political decentralization. As I mentioned, it really depends on the country context. In some countries, administrative and fiscal decentralization is emphasized over political decentralization. So in that case, you could focus on those aspects and perhaps look at more indirectly at accountability processes, which is more associated with political decentralization. Another question in terms of whether we always focus on vertical decentralization. Well, if you understand vertical decentralization in terms of transferring functions from the central level to the local level, that's one aspect of it. But it can also be, if you mean horizontal decentralization by transferring functions from subnational line departments to local governments, yes, that also includes that aspect. So I would say it refers to both, and again, it depends on the country context, whichever aspects are emphasized. Then, in terms of evidence and which form of decentralization is better, in meeting the rights of the child? That's a very complicated question. I think in overall, in terms of evidence and decentralization, it's very difficult. Again, I would say it depends on the country context. So if a country context emphasizes devolution, then it would be important to support this devolution process, and then you would try to achieve results in child rights through this way. Whether in another country context, other aspects such as deconcentration are focused on, then that would be probably the way to go in terms of achieving child rights. Okay, can we invite 3 more questions?
Yes, so we have one question also continue on that one. What role can UNICEF play in this? So we can take 2 more questions if you can type or indicate if you want to speak.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, this is Jeff Tay from Wakala. Thank you for the answer to the first question. I seem not to have heard the answer to this question relating to the role that UNICEF can play in a context where there is a country in the decentralization process. Are we expected to advise the country to support that process? I think it's important because many countries in our regions, we all talk about decentralization in this part of the world, and it will be important that we get a sense of how can we position ourselves in terms of advice to the various governments.
Okay, thank you. Good answer.
Okay, in terms of the role that UNICEF can play and whether we're expected to advise to the country to engage in decentralization or not, I think UNICEF, this is a question that has come up previously in discussion, but I think UNICEF should probably take a neutral role towards decentralization. But as soon as the country makes concrete steps towards a decentralization reform process, then yes, UNICEF should try to support the country in doing so. And this is also something that, as I mentioned, the Stocktake the Stocktake will inform the development of a strategic framework. So this is a question that I will try to address more within the context of the strategic framework. In terms of questions around in context, in fragile context, and whether UNICEF should engage there. Yes, there are examples that UNICEF supports decentralized environments within fragile contexts, quite often so because, as was mentioned in a comment, sometimes the central government is not stable enough to provide the essential services. So then in that case, it is a good entry point to work with local governments. And this happens, for instance, in Somalia, UNICEF actively engages within decentralized environments and supporting local governments in improving service delivery. Let's see. In terms of the strategic entry points for UNICEF to systematically influence child rights and decentralization processes, again, it seems like I don't have all the answers, and that is because it's really highly context specific. And what the best case scenario would be to do an in-depth analysis of what the country context is, and to thereby identify key entry points for engagement. And again, in terms of the strategic framework that will be under development, we'll give some pointers on how to do that analysis or which areas to look for.
So, whether there are strategic entry points for UNICEF to systematically influence child rights in the decentralization process. Maybe we have to now.
Okay, just a few more questions. There's a question, what would be the situation when a country is decentralized by law, but in practice the local governments still depend on central state government? Also a very a good question, and also a very complex question to answer. Again, it depends. I think it would be good to still work with local governments in that context and to try to support them in implementing their roles and responsibilities that they are supposed to implement, but perhaps at the same time look at the reasons behind why local governments still strongly depend on the central state in this case. For instance, it's possible that they are assigned certain functions, but that the resources or the staff have not been assigned in this case. So that would then indicate that there is another area that maybe should be focused on in order to ensure that local governments are unable to implement the role that they're supposed to do.
Okay, so the last question from our colleague in India. Decentralization works well with the three Fs, funds, functions, and functionaries. All are equally well developed. Still engaging child rights and areas like easier children are not critical actors if they tested a strategy to reduce. Okay. And we have another question about the dissemination of such topics. So you will hear an answer for some of these questions on the second part, and if you still have questions, we can answer them during the second Q&A session after the second part of the presentation. So I guess it's good to move forward and hear the second part of the presentation, which is very interesting. Which is about the findings of the global Stocktake and UNICEF kind of experience in DeLoG.
Okay, so now on to the findings of the global stocktake. I will first present a brief background on this stocktake, including objectives, the methodology, scope, as well as presenting a draft conceptual framework for this work. Then I will go into the findings of the stocktake, and at the end there will be time for some reflections and again a question and answer session. So the objectives of the stocktake is really to clarify key DeLoG concepts as well as the conceptual framework, to identify key UNICEF engagement areas and implementation strategies used in this area, to identify challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned, also to support internal UNICEF learning and knowledge exchange, and to inform the development of a strategic framework on DeLoG as well as specific guidance topics. The methodology of the stocktake included a desk review of external as well as internal documentation on DeLoG. For instance, I reviewed some documentation that was developed in ROSA as well as in EPRO, and specifically an evaluation that was done in that region. I also conducted quite some talks with country and regional offices to see what their engagement is in this area as well as challenges and opportunities. Then I did a analysis of country office annual reports from 2011 to 2014. We did this through a word search on key DeLoG terms. Of course, this is not perfect. The list of keywords may not be comprehensive enough. As I mentioned, sometimes terms in certain countries are used that are not used in other countries. But in some cases, social policy staff completed the questionnaire. So when combining the data from the country office annual reports and the DeLoG questionnaire, we developed country profiles for DeLoG engagement, and we found that around 95 country offices engage in these areas. And I've put all the data in an Excel file, which I've also uploaded on the PF4C community of practice. So you can review this later on and see who is engaging in what area. In terms of the scope of the stocktake, I consider all three areas of decentralization, and an evaluation that was done in EPRO on UNICEF's response to decentralization made a distinction between programming on decentralization and engagement in decentralized environments, and I thought this was an important distinction, so I've considered this in the stocktake as well, and I will explain a little bit more about that in the next slide. Also, the role or the emphasis is on the role of local governments. So it's not so much on deconcentration. Of course, it's considered when it's part of an overall decentralization reform process. But again, the focus here is on local governments implementing service delivery functions. Then the stocktake considers key UNICEF implementation strategies as described in the strategic plan, and the stocktake also considers specific thematic areas. So when you combine all this, you get something like this. here on the top three circles, these represent engagement on decentralization. This really influences the overall center-local relationships, and this has political, administrative, and fiscal aspects. And I've included some examples. For instance, in administrative decentralization, I've included the example of functional reassignment. In fiscal decentralization, there is the example of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. There is overlap between these different circles to represent the close relationships and sometimes the overlap between these different areas. Now, the bottom three circles again represent fiscal, political, and administrative decentralization, but now within decentralized environments. So this is really the work with local governments on a local level. And again, I included some examples in these circles for your reference. And there is an arrow in the middle, and this is to emphasize that there is a link between what happens on a national level and what happens on a local level. And a specific example I could give is, for instance, that if you work on a local level with local governments on local budgeting, this is also influenced by the work that is done on a national level in terms of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. So fiscal transfers provide funds to local governments. If these funds arrive late, then obviously this would influence your local budgeting process. Also represented in this slide is the key implementation strategies, and on the right side I have mentioned key thematic areas. Now, what we do, what are the key engagement areas of UNICEF? Now, it turns out that from the country profiles, most country offices engage in political decentralization, followed by administrative and fiscal aspects of decentralizations. And also most country offices engage within decentralized environments, so within the below three circles, and then specifically in the blue circles, so on political decentralization within decentralized environments. So this is the mostly the key focus of country offices. Now, this is a snapshot of UNICEF engagement in political decentralization. These are examples taken from annual reports. It's the writing is a little bit small. I'm not sure if you can read it. But these are by no means all examples. I just taken a few for your reference. So here, there is a focus, for instance, on the development of a policy framework for decentralization on a national level, which Moldova engaged in. There is a focus on local planning, as well as data collection and M&E, and more participatory processes. And one example that I want to highlight is the work done in Nicaragua which was mentioned in the 2012 Country Office Annual Report, where they focused on strengthening child-focused data systems at the municipal level in order to support local planning processes. Now, in the interest of time, I won't be going through all these examples, but maybe this is something that you would like to review once this presentation has been finalized. This is a snapshot of UNICEF engagement in administrative decentralization. There is quite some focus in this area on functional reassignment. Again, across a country context, it was done in Moldova, which is a middle-income country, as well as in Malawi. In Bangladesh, there was quite some focus on coordination. In Somalia, in a fragile context. There was some work done on piloting functional reassignment in the area of health and education and water management functions, and there it was actually found that decentralized services were improved when supported by local governments. And this is a snapshot of UNICEF engagement in fiscal decentralization. Here, there is quite some focus on fiscal transfers on the national level. There was actually previously a webinar done on this topic, which you can read on, and documentation is posted also on the PF4C community of practice. Some other examples focus mainly on local budgeting and local budgeting accountability, and I think the example from Dominican Republic is quite interesting, as they work together with a strategic partner, namely the Dominican Federation of Municipalities, to strengthen local budgeting processes. Now, in terms of the thematic focus, out of the 95 country offices, 64 mention some type of thematic focus, most frequently in the area of disaster risk reduction, followed by child-friendly local governance or child-friendly cities. It's named differently in different contexts. There is also quite some focus on supporting women within political processes, or supporting women to engage in local participation. And there is, in some context, a focus on strengthening resilience and peace building. And I think especially the focus on local governance and disaster risk reduction will be strengthened in the future, particularly seeing the recent Sendai framework, which really focuses on the role of local governments in disaster risk planning and management. So this is a snapshot of UNICEF thematic focus. So for instance, in Bangladesh, some work was done around disaster risk reduction. In Nigeria, some work was done around peace building. And so you can review this in more detail later. Now, in terms of how we do it, there is not one specific implementation strategy that is used in this area, probably because it's really quite broad. What we can say is that on a national level, there is a focus on policy dialogue and advocacy, whereas on a subnational level, there is more focus on capacity development and partnerships. Why do we engage in DeLoG? Well, DeLoG is frequently described, the framework for engagement. DeLoG is frequently described in key program documents, for instance, the UNDAF country program documents, as well as annual reports. However, analysis of DeLoG processes as well as strategies for engagement are not as frequently mentioned. 37 country offices indicated to have included analysis of DeLoG within the situational analysis. Oops. And only 10 country offices reported to have conducted a comprehensive assessment on DeLoG processes. So I think this is an area that could be improved. So in terms of why do we engage in DeLoG? Well, it's most frequently country offices mentioned it's to improve equity and services for children, and another frequently mentioned area was to strengthen systems, so health and education systems, for instance. In terms of partnerships, who do we work with? On a national level, key partners include sector ministries such as health, education, social welfare, and this is followed by NGOs. What I think is interesting that here ministries of local government as well as Ministry of Planning and Finance are mentioned less frequently, and potential strategic partners such as civil service academies and local government associations are also not mentioned that often. On a subnational level, there is quite broad engagement. Obviously, there's a lot of engagement with local government staff, with political leadership, as well as subnational line departments and user groups and NGOs. So there is not one partner. With partnerships with development partners, UNICEF country offices report most frequently to work together with other UN agencies. Overall, this graph reflects adequate engagement with DPs. However, I think it could be stronger, especially seeing that DeLoG involves areas that UNICEF is not traditionally, it's not a traditional UNICEF subject area. So I think within DeLoG, it's quite important to work with partners, especially other development partners. When reviewing annual reports, I saw that the focus is quite often on activities and as well as outputs, and not so much on results. So we decided to include this as a specific question within the DeLoG questionnaire. We asked country offices to mention specific outputs, outcomes, and impacts related to decentralization. And this is some examples that were given. Again, the focus was very much on outputs as well as activities, and less so on intermediate outcomes and impact level, which is also understandable, seeing that decentralization processes are often very long. So it's difficult to see the immediate impact of our work in this area. Some other country offices mentioned that this work should indeed be documented better to show results. Again, some others mentioned there are no specific results for DeLoG, but rather results are gained within sectors. And some country offices mentioned that it's too early to tell what the specific results are. In the questionnaire, I asked also about the three main internal challenges. Now, what the responses that I received were not only on internal challenges, but also addressed external challenges. So I thought this gave a good opportunity to frame it within a SWOT framework, so dividing internal and external challenges and opportunities, of course. In terms of internal strengths and challenges in DeLoG, UNICEF mentions strong UNICEF presence in the field, UNICEF relationships with both national and subnational level stakeholders, knowledge and leaderships in social sectors, as well as relationships with other development partners. In terms of challenges, frequently there were mentioned some gaps in technical capacities related to decentralization and local governance, as well as gaps in financial resources to program on these areas. Some specific challenges mentioned were in terms of the scale-up and sustainability of UNICEF-supported interventions, vertical programming silos within UNICEF, so the difficulty to work across results areas, Some country offices or some respondents mentioned that there's not always buy-in from the entire office to engage in this area, and that there is an absence of a clear and articulated entry points for UNICEF engagement. Basically, country offices find it difficult to position to identify UNICEF's niche in this area. In terms of external opportunities and challenges, in both areas, both opportunities and challenges, some examples that were given were quite context specific. So some opportunities mentioned were that there is a great push for decentralization, that there is a great willingness and commitments of local governments to engage, whereas some challenges were mentioned that there was not enough push for decentralization, and that there was the absence of political will or incomplete decentralization reform processes. This really depends on the country context. There were also some general opportunities mentioned. It was mentioned that DeLoG offers opportunities to focus on equity, as well as to increase the efficiency of service delivery. In terms of challenges, it was also mentioned a few times that UNICEF is not always considered to be a subject player, both by, say, government partners as well as other development partners. So this is something that needs to be addressed. And also the DeLoG agenda includes issues beyond UNICEF mandate in capacity, and this is true. And again, therefore, there should be some emphasis on both strategic partnership as well as really identifying what the strategic niche or the area of engagement for UNICEF would be in this area. Now, these lessons learned also come from the questionnaire. Let's see. So first of all, it was mentioned by respondents that engagement in DeLoG is crucial to achieve child rights and an equity agenda on a local level. As one respondent noted, it's a prerequisite in achieving country program objectives. Also, it was mentioned that political economy factors are to be considered when engaging in decentralization, both on national and local level. Thorough analysis of DeLoG and the country-specific context is really crucial to the success of DeLoG programming. And within this, also strategic partnerships are key, and UNICEF needs to identify its niche in DeLoG. Ownership of local counterparts was also frequently mentioned, as well as the need for systematic capacity building, especially as it was in the challenges frequently mentioned that frequent changes in local political leadership. So it was really identified that we need to look for ways to overcome that. And this could, for instance, be through partnerships with local government associations or training institutes. Another key challenge which was mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing one of the respondents, is that multi-sectoral approaches are vital and worthwhile, but also intensely challenging. So this is related to both internal processes as well as externally. So to work multi-sectoral within UNICEF, as well as engaging sector ministries to work multi-sectoral on a subnational level. Then it was mentioned to better document initiatives and best practices, and that successful engagement in DeLoG requires the strengthening of internal capacity. These were some of the key support needs that were mentioned. As become clear also from the previous slide, financial resources were really a key area which was mentioned. More financial resources are needed to effectively engage in DeLoG, and as well to improve monitoring and evaluation in this area. Then other areas that were highlighted were training and learning opportunities, guidance and tools on DeLoG, as well as a roster of consultants. Now, in terms of reflection, I would say there is UNICEF really broadly engages in DeLoG. So I think it's not really about engaging more, but it's rather about engaging more strategically in DeLoG across results areas. So this would require more strategic and analysis-based programming, including results-based M&E. And I would say there should be a more emphasis on connecting the dots. So how do the different aspects of decentralization relate to each other? How does the work on decentralization relate to the work within decentralized environments? How does the work in sectors relate to DeLoG and vice versa? So it's also really about what do we want to achieve through this work, and how do we measure and document results in a results-based manner. And for this, of course, some financial and technical resources are needed. Now, in terms of moving forward, this presentation is finalized, but the actual document, this Stocktake, will be finalized also based on your feedback today. Then there will be work done on the development of a strategic framework. This is from June onwards, and this will include the development of a very broad overall theory of change, which will hopefully give some guidance in terms of how we can engage strategically within a country context. And we'll also look at the question of what is UNICEF's niche in this area. And I have established an informal reference group of people within country offices. If you're interested in engaging in this reference group and engaging in this discussion, that would be really great, and you could let us know. Then another point would be to develop technical notes or specific topics related to decentralization and local governance. We already had one webinar on intergovernmental fiscal transfers. You can find this information on the PF4C community of practice. Some future webinars are planned related to disaster risk reduction and peace building. And I'm also interested in the topic of functional reassignment. One of the questions that was in the questionnaire asked which topics would be of most interest, so I will review these, and these can be highlighted. But if there's any topic that you find interesting, please also let us know that we can prioritize this. So for now, this work on decentralization is on the community of practice, the PF4C community of practice. Maybe as this work continues in the future, it deserves its own community of practice. But for now, you can find key background documentation on the PF4C site. Now, in terms of discussion, please feel free to ask questions, but I also thought it would be interesting if we could discuss and share some examples around how to program strategically on DeLoG, to talk about strategic partnerships, working multi-sectoral successes and challenges, as well as results-based M&E. So I will be reviewing some of the questions that have already come in. If you have any other questions, please type them in the message box. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Maria. So we are kind of on time, and we have around 30 minutes to for this second part of the Q&A session, the discussion. We'd love to hear your feedback, comments, and as I saw Nicoletta, you want to speak? I just unmuted your microphone. Nicoletta, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, Nima, I didn't get it. Sorry. I was just I think we could have also a separate discussion, because I think we have to discuss a little bit more how these activities that you identify are categorized in these three forms of decentralization. Because it's not evident that the local planning actually goes into political decentralization, as well as local budgeting to fiscal decentralization. If we go by the book, let's say like that, if we go by the book, we're going to have some issue if we put out something like that. But I think we can find a way. Perhaps we can, I don't know if there is any willingness, we can perhaps think about, beside the three forms of decentralization, another category that could be public expenditure management at the local level. So we work by the book on political, administrative, and fiscal, and then we can in order to use common terms in decentralization and public financial management at the local level. It's just a suggestion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nicoletta. I was expecting this question, actually, because I know officially local budgeting doesn't really fit within the framework of fiscal decentralization. But it was, I've kind of taken the liberty of definitions not being clear, so that also means that we can maybe make our own definitions which are useful for the organization. And the reason why I put local budgeting in this area is because then we categorize all areas that relates to public finance in one area. So it was really a way of structuring our work and to clearly identify the areas where there is overlap between the public finance for children's work and the work between decentralization. But this is something that we can review as well.
Okay. Mohammed, yeah. Can you hear us, Mohammed?
I can hear you very well.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Can you hear me? All right. Thank you very much, Maria, for that beautiful presentation. Just wanted to add a few points.
I'm sorry, it's very difficult to hear you. Could you turn up the mic?
Okay, let me try again. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
No, it's not clear.
Not clear.
Perhaps it's better if you type the comment. I will respond to a different question at the moment. All right, so Richard Bridle, who I work with in Cambodia, asked the question whether it would be interesting to look at governance within UNICEF and how to map it against aspects of our of the conceptual framework. And yes, that would be very interesting, and that's also something that we are planning to do within the strategic framework. So to really map out how the work across results areas corresponds with the work on decentralization. So Anjali asked a question about social accountability and the participation and engagement of children. Yes, this is also an important aspect. I try to reflect it a little bit within the context of political decentralization. Within the Stocktake document, this is highlighted more in detail. And then in terms of the child-friendly local governance work work that I know that you are doing in Nepal. This is mentioned as a separate thematic area, and this is also something that I will go deeper into within the actual Stocktake document. Then there is a question on that more and more countries are moving towards decentralization and specifically devolution, and how can that process influence guidance in preparing country program documents? Well, there are some examples that I found around 10 country offices that mentioned that they did a specific analysis of decentralization and local governance within the country context, and that served as a basis for strategic programming in this area. So I would say that if you are in a country context where decentralization and devolution are really high on the agenda, then it would be useful to perhaps do a deeper analysis on decentralization reform processes and how it may affect child rights. Then the question by, or the comment by Mohammed at the need to look at what the sectors are doing as they are working on a local level, especially on the community levels in improving service delivery. That's correct. I think in terms of decentralization and local governance, we need to closely work together with sectors, because oftentimes decentralization doesn't only refer to strengthening service delivery by line departments, but it also includes service delivery by local governments. So this should be seen holistically across sectors. So this would also require that social policy staff works together with sector colleagues and the other way around as well, and to come up with a comprehensive multi-sectoral approach of engaging in this area. And there are some examples of country offices that have successfully done this work, and I also think this may be an interesting topic to explore further in future webinars and technical notes.
Hello.
Yes, please introduce yourself.
Yes. I'm happy to learn that there is a community of practice for this, and my role in the regional office does not directly link with social policy. I'm in charge of strategic partnerships, but I'm very much interested in this topic because of my background and experience. Is there any situation where we have countries that have signed kind of specific cooperation agreement with local municipalities, and has that been part of the country implementation arrangements? I'm just trying to hear what experience other countries have in relation to working directly with municipalities in this context.
Thank you.
All right, so in terms of cooperation agreements with municipalities, I I can look this up. I know there are some difficulties around this because the agreements are mostly signed with ministries on a national level, and it's actually a point that I wanted to explore further in the future. So to really look at engagement modalities at the subnational level, and how can UNICEF structure itself to engage effectively on a local level, be it either through zonal offices or, for instance, through cooperation agreements with municipalities. And this is something that, that I would like to explore further. And perhaps this is also a question that we can pose on the community of practice to see whether other country offices have experiences in this area. And I would be happy to get back to you later on this with more information.
Okay. Thank you, Neymar.
Okay. Then again, the question of Richard, sorry, perhaps I didn't understand the question fully in the beginning, but I think it's an interesting point that you raise in terms of the structuring of our own organization. And this is a point that also recently came up in discussions of how we can ourselves function as UNICEF in a decentralized manner, particularly when it comes to global indicators and country offices having to respond to global indicators, as well as country offices having to respond to a specific country context. So, and I also heard that there was an interesting paper written about this coming out of the Innocenti Research Center. So I'd be happy to share this, but this is maybe something also that can be addressed in the area of how we as UNICEF can effectively engage within decentralized environments, as I mentioned to the previous person who asked the question, in terms of how do we organize ourselves on a subnational level, what are our key engagement modalities. And I think another important point is that even within a country context, there may be strategic plans on a national level, but what happens on a local level, they may have their own strategic plans and their own priorities. So it's important to keep in mind how UNICEF can effectively support local governments to implement their own priorities and not to push for a more vertical agenda in this area. I hope this somewhat answers your question. The question of Dominic, do we have a timeline for the final report and the strategic framework? Well, in terms of the Stocktake, I hope to finalize the document in the next month, in June. In terms of the strategic framework, this will be a longer exercise, as it would require engagement with government country offices as well as regional offices, and to work really on a theory of change jointly. So this will take some time. Our idea or our aim is to have some sort of working theory of change by the end of the year, and also to see how this can influence, for instance, the midterm review of the strategic plan.
Okay, thank you. We can take, I guess, two, three more questions. please submit your questions, or if you want to speak, unmute your microphone.
Hi, Anjali. Yes, it's possible that there in countries there is no full devolution, and that there is a mismatch between sectoral planning as well as local planning. Often this is because there is no the functions are not clearly defined, so the responsibilities for functions are not clearly defined. So there is overlap between functions that local governments need to implement, as well as functions that line departments, for instance, implement. So in this case, it would also be important, if there is opportunity for this, to more clearly define their roles and responsibilities of each level of governance, and to focus on coordination between the different local actors.
Okay. Any more questions? If there is not any question, we conclude the webinar session here. Thanks again for your participation, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us or to post your questions on our community of practice. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.